authorize it. Consent to permit Karen Williams from Ward 7 and Ruth Wattenberg from Ward 3 to participate in this meeting by telephone. Are there any objections? Thank you. Members, we have a draft agenda before us. Are there corrections or additions? Seeing no changes, I entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? The motion is approved. And members, we have the minutes from our July 11th working session before us. Are there corrections or additions to the minutes? Seeing no changes, I will postpone a vote on this until one of our colleagues is reached by telephone. All right. Good evening. My name is Jack Jacobson, and I'm the Ward 2 representative and vice president of the State Board of Education. On behalf of the members of the District of Columbia State Board of Education, I want to welcome our guests and our viewing public to our Wednesday, July 18th public meeting. The State Board typically holds its regularly scheduled meetings on the third Wednesday of every month at the Old Council Chambers here at 441 4th Street Northwest. In addition to broadcasting this meeting live via the District Knowledge Network, we are also live streaming by Periscope on Twitter, and the video for the hearing will be posted on our YouTube page once the meeting concludes. Tonight's agenda includes important votes on two matters: draft credit recovery regulations and the State Board's budget. Credit recovery has been a much discussed topic since it was revealed that schools and local education agencies had been misapplying or ignoring policies and guidelines related to credit recovery programs. These would be their own internal guidelines. Credit recovery is supposed to provide students that have failed a course with an opportunity to continue to move forward on the path to graduation. Unfortunately, some students were placed into these programs rather than getting the assistance they need to succeed within the regular classroom environment. A report commissioned by the state superintendent recommended the addition of statewide regulations to ensure appropriate use of credit recovery programs. I want to thank the state superintendent, Hansel Kang, and her team for their hard work on this issue. Public input on regulations like these is vital, and throughout the process, OSSE and the State Board have kept a focus on developing regulations that will put the students' needs first. Proposed regulations, once approved by the State Board, would be published in the DC Register for 30 days of public comment prior to coming back to the State Board for a vote on final regulations. It is important for our schools to have a solid foundation for credit recovery programs that puts the future of our students in the forefront. Throughout this process, I am confident the State Board and State Superintendent will find the right balance. I now turn the floor over to our State Superintendent, Hansel Kang, for any opening statement she may have.
Thank you very much, Vice President Jacobson. Tonight, as you mentioned, the State Board of Education will consider a resolution to approve emergency and proposed regulations on credit recovery. The draft emergency and proposed regulations reflect several months of conversations and feedback between OSSE, the State Board of Education, the Public Charter School Board, and Charter LEAs and DCPS. The board began conversations in April by hosting policy experts on credit recovery. OSSE brought proposals to the May, June, and July working sessions, and the board took public comment on the emergency and proposed regulations at the July public meeting. At the June public meeting? Okay, yes, at the June public meeting, thank you. The proposal has been transparently drafted and deliberated consistent with procedures set forth by the State Board. Approving the resolution before you this evening will allow me to submit emergency regulations effective for 120 days. In addition, OSSE would submit the regulations for proposed rulemaking, which would begin the public comment period for at least 30 days. Tonight, I encourage the State Board of Education to approve the resolution on approving the emergency and proposed regulations as drafted, and I would like to outline the reasons why. The recent graduation and attendance investigation found that DC, like many other jurisdictions, lacked state-level regulations that govern the use of credit recovery courses across all LEAs. Moving forward, this regulation would address that gap. Broadly, the proposed regulation waives the 120-hour seat time requirement for credit recovery classes, so students can enroll in credit recovery courses to make up missed content independent of how much time it takes to do so. It reserves credit recovery only for students that have completed and failed the course, thus prohibiting the practice of enrolling students in credit recovery courses when they have not taken the underlying course. And in addition, the requirement for LEAs to have transparent written policies does not exist currently, and the regulation improves that consistency and accountability by requiring LEAs to publicly post these policies, which must address student eligibility, enrollment, assessment, and parent notification. Credit recovery courses should demand the same standard of students as underlying courses do. That's why the proposed regulations require credit recovery courses to be aligned with statewide content standards as adopted by OSSE and this board, and have the same grading expectations as the underlying course. And as a critical step forward, this body pressed OSSE to collect data on the use of credit recovery in our schools, and we responded to this input in a significant way. The proposed regulation will collect and share public information on the use of credit recovery courses in our schools by requiring local education agencies to submit an annual compliance report that contains information on the number of students who fail courses, are subsequently referred to credit recovery, and successfully pass the credit recovery courses. It will also require LEAs to report on the number of students enrolling in multiple credit recovery courses in a year, and require data to be collected and reported by subgroup. When reviewing credit recovery policies in other states, none of them require data collection and reporting of this magnitude, if at all. This is important information to guide our future efforts in addressing credit recovery, and this has all been done due to your input. To me, it is clear that these draft emergency and proposed regulations are a strong product that addresses the key findings of the graduation and attendance investigation. They represent a significant step forward on establishing statewide guardrails and transparency on the use of credit recovery. I have also heard board members rightfully express concerns about the rigor of credit recovery courses and all other courses. I agree with you that it is imperative that we hold our students to a high bar for academic success. As I have stated since I've taken on the role of state superintendent, far too many of our students, especially our students of color, of economic disadvantage, and those with disabilities, have not been prepared for success in college or career when graduating from high school. And I understand that this leads us to a range of emotions and reactions. Each of us on this dais, along with many educators, parents, and advocates, share those feelings, and it's why we engage in this difficult work. We also use the levers that are available to us. OSSE and the State Board have the ability and the responsibility to address instructional quality and rigor in a manner consistent with our lawful authority. And our lawful authority in this area is not insignificant. Together, we set academic standards, we approve statewide assessments, set graduation requirements, and establish a statewide accountability system. Our accountability system uses multiple measures, values student growth, and expects progress from all students. We are providing more information on the performance of our schools to the public through our soon-to-be-released report card, and I believe this will drive improvement from the ground up. I encourage you to not diminish the importance of these functions, for they are foundational to this system. I understand your desire to do more, but in our quest to do more, it is important to recognize which policy tools are ours and which are not. Digging into the intricacies of curriculum and instruction is not the role of OSSE as the state education agency, but is best left up to the schools and LEAs that I believe are poised to do so. I understand there are some last-minute proposals on using the competency-based unit waiver application for credit recovery, and I wanted to speak to that briefly as well. Board members this afternoon were provided with an update to the FAQ document that we've shared previously at the prior working session. This document provides some background on the competency-based waiver application. In particular, you may refer to questions 20 to 27 in the FAQ document that was shared earlier today. Many of the components of the competency-based waiver application are already addressed in the regulation. For example, alignment to standards, disclosure of course offerings and times, and data collection and reporting. There are 3 components from the competency application that are not addressed in the credit recovery regulation: resources and instructional materials used, course syllabus, and scope and sequence of the academic program, and the methods the school will use to annually evaluate the competency-based learning processes. Although these materials are important for educators at LEAs in evaluating school-level competency-based waiver applications, this is not information that is as meaningful for LEA policies or easily accessible to the public. Further, since OSSE does not oversee the instructional decisions of LEAs in schools, these documents at the school level would not serve the same public benefit. Also, the competency waiver is a school-based application that is approved by LEAs and the PCSB in the case of a public charter school, whereas the credit recovery regulations establish required components that must be applied consistently across LEAs. This brings uniformity to the credit recovery program throughout the LEA, and we believe that consistency is important. Finally, I'll just say I appreciate you all allowing me to take a little bit more time than I typically do, and I thank you for your thoughtful consideration and deliberation on this issue of credit recovery. These rules address significant issues that we're seeing in the delivery of credit recovery in the District of Columbia and establish a much-needed foundation. I'm pleased to hear of the desire to build on these proposed regulations in the future. Approving tonight's resolution would not mean that our work on credit recovery is done. Over the next year, we would obtain LEA-level policies on the implementation of credit recovery and data on its use in our schools that would allow us to better consider the use of credit recovery throughout our schools and take further steps as needed. Therefore, I urge you to approve the resolution as submitted. Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent King, and thank you for the lengthy explanation. We take your words to heart, and we look forward to continuing to work with you, either long-term, improving the plan that's presented tonight, or in shorter term, working on regulations to be improved before they're put out to the public. So, thank you. The State Board welcomes public participation in the activities under our authority. At every public meeting, we begin with testimony from public witnesses on education-related matters. Your comments will be part of our official record. If you are a member of the public and would like to speak at a future public meeting, please contact our staff by email at sboe.dc.gov or by calling 202-741-0888. Tonight, I believe we have one witness. Is Carrie Brown with the volunteer tutor at Horton's Kids here tonight? Okay, we will skip that.
Mr. President.
Mr. Hayworth?
May I also note that Ms. Brown's testimony, it has been loaded to Assembly as well, so members can review at their leisure.
Thank you. And colleagues and attendees and witnesses, we have two of our board members are on the telephone, Ms. Wattenberg from Ward 3 and Ms. Williams from Ward 7. Bear with us when we get to discussion and votes. It gets a little complex, but we want to make sure that they have an opportunity to participate. And we're going to start with going back to the delayed vote on the July 11th working session minutes. Do I have a motion to approve, to accept the minutes?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Weedon. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Ms. Carter. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The minutes are approved. Now we're moving to our budget vote. Each year, the State Board approves a need for appropriations that is sent to the mayor for inclusion in her budget. This year, the mayor has requested that the State Board's request be submitted by mid-August. Our fiscal year 2020 request provides a current services funding level for the three offices that comprise the State Board: the Office of the State Board, the Office of the Ombudsman for Public Education, and the Office of the Student Advocate. In fiscal year 2020, which begins on October 1st, 2019, the State Board has a need for appropriations of $1,928,000, with $286,000 of that being spent on program activities and the remainder on personnel. The State Board is also requesting 4 additional items in our fiscal 2020 budget: 2 additional staff members, 1 for the State Board and 1 for the Student Advocate, professional development funding for the Ombudsman, and a legislative provision that would create a salary adjustment for State Board members similar to the one received by members of the Council. For benefit of those at home, I'm going to explain how the process we will follow. First, I would like a motion on the budget resolution itself. Once the resolution is read into the record, we will debate the resolution and vote on it. Next, I will look for a motion on the first 3 budget requests, the personnel and professional development. We will debate and vote on these 3 requests before moving to the final budget enhancement related to State Board salaries as our third and final item. Colleagues, is there a motion on the underlying budget resolution?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Weedon. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Ms. Carter. Mr. Hayworth, would you please read the resolution into the record?
State Board of Education Resolution, DC State Board of Education Fiscal Year 2020 Need for Appropriations Resolution, SR 18-5. Whereas in 2013, the District of Columbia Council approved the State Board of Education Personnel Authority Amendment Act of 2012, effective April 27, 2013, to ensure that the District of Columbia State Board of Education had the authority to operate as an independent agency, including through the hiring of its own staff and preparing its own budget. Whereas DC Official Code Section 38-2652D3 reads, beginning in fiscal year 2013, the board shall prepare and submit to the mayor for inclusion in the annual budget prepared and submitted to the council pursuant to Part D of Subchapter 4 of Chapter 2 of Title I, annual estimates of the expenditures and appropriations necessary for the operation of the board for the year. All the estimates shall be forwarded by the mayor to the council for, in addition to the mayor's recommendations, action by the council pursuant to 1-204.46 and 1-206.03C. Whereas the whereas the DC State Board of Education staff have prepared a budget that reflects the need for appropriations to meet the priorities of the three offices of the State Board: the Office of the State Board of Education, the Office of the Ombudsman for Public Education, and the Office of the Student Advocate in fiscal year 2020. Whereas the proposed fiscal year 2020 budget and related enhancements have been discussed at a working session of the DC State Board of Education on July 11, 2018. Whereas the DC State Board of Education is appreciative of the trust placed in it by residents and shall remain open and transparent about its spending. And whereas in the fiscal year that begins on October 1st, 2019, the DC State Board of Education proposes a need of appropriations of $1,928,000, with $286,000 being spent on program activities and the remainder on personnel. Now therefore, be it resolved that on July 18th, 2018, the State Board approves its fiscal year 2020 need for appropriations and requests that the mayor include in her annual budget submission the estimate approved herein.
Thank you, Mr. Hayworth. Is there discussion on the resolution? I'll take the mic then really quickly. I want to thank our Ombudsman for Public Education, Joanna Smith, and our Chief Student Advocate, Faith Gibson-Hubbard, for working with us, for working with our teams to get these budgets in a timely manner. The timeline we had was very much truncated, and we appreciate you all working so quickly and cooperatively with us to get this in on the mayor's schedule. Seeing no discussion and no amendments on the budget, the motion is on approval of State Board Resolution 18-5. All in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Any abstentions?
Abstention.
The motion is approved. I will now accept a motion on the three budget enhancements. That's the 2 personnel positions and the professional development.
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Carter. Is there a second? Seconded by Mr. Weedon. Is there discussion? The motion being properly moved and second, I will ask Mr. Hayworth to read a summary of the enhancements into the record.
Enhancement number 1, providing enhanced community service. The DC State Board of Education is requesting the addition of a new full-time employee to assist them in coordinating state board activities throughout the city, providing promote community engagement in the statewide education process and continue its work in hearing historically marginalized voices. Enhancement number 2.
Thank you very much.
Enhancement number 2. The Office of the Ombudsman for Public Education requires a need for funding for professional development opportunities, trainings, and the ability to compensate employee performance. The proposed funds would allow for staff to receive essential opportunities for professional development, to keep them abreast of current best practices on both the national and local levels, and understand frameworks for implementation to support the needs of families in order to improve the quality of the services and programming offered to students and families in the Office of the Ombudsman for Public Education. Enhancement 3. The Parent and Student Empowerment Act of 2012 established the Office of the Student Advocate within the DC State Board of Education. The Office of the Student Advocate guides and supports students, parents, and families and community members in navigating the public school system to achieve equal access to public education through advocacy, outreach, and information services. The Office of the Student Advocate is an uncommon model that is not easily comparable, but after taking into account the statutory requirements for the office and based on the current request for assistance, the State Board anticipates that the need for assistance may be larger than originally expected. Thus, the addition of one additional assistant student advocate will allow the Office of the Student Advocate to more effectively and efficiently manage and promptly respond to requests for assistance from students and parents.
Thank you, Mr. Hayworth. Is there a discussion on the enhancements? Ms. Wattenberg already spoke that she was, I think that was indicating support for the personnel position, so thank you, Ms. Wattenberg. Is there additional discussion on the budget enhancements before us? Mr. Weedon.
I just want to reiterate your thanks to the offices of the Student Advocate and Ombudsman, as well as the State Board staff for their work. We've seen a tremendous increase in the capabilities of each office over the 3 years I've been on the board, and I believe we're poised to do a lot more. I'm fully supportive of these amendments, as I believe we need to do a lot more, especially for those who are most at risk in our city.
Thank you, Mr. Weedon, and I associate my remarks with yours. Any additional comments? With that, the motion is on approval of the 3 budget enhancements before us. All in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions?
Abstain.
With Ms. Wilson-Phelan abstaining, the motion is approved. I will now accept a motion on the budget enhancement related to State Board salaries. Is there a motion?
So move.
Moved by Ms. Williams. Is there a second? Second by Mr. Weedon. Discussion. Ms. Carter?
So we will talk about the actual enhancement, and as a representative of this board and a taxpayer of Washington, D.C., I do not support this enhancement at all. First and foremost, I would like to correct the record. The statements regarding this enhancement, notably in the sections titled Problem Statement and Cost Benefit Analysis, use the word salary. Please note that the $15,000 currently budgeted for is a stipend, not a salary, and was initially put into place to offset the travel and transportation expenses members incur while performing board duties in their official capacity as elected representatives. Secondly, while I believe that our members work very hard, we should be doing so because we believe in the mission of public education and reforming the current state of education in this city. We are public servants and should not reward ourselves with increased pay. While the problem statement section of this enhancement states that, quote, the salaries of these hardworking part-time public servants has not changed, end quote, since the creation of the board more than a decade ago, I would like to point out that the responsibilities have not changed either. We still work on the same policy issues. Several members of the board are active in the community on issues of importance to our schools, such as budget and modernization issues. And while I commend and encourage all of our members to be active on education issues outside of our purview, however, that is not the actual work of the board and should not be used in making a decision to increase our stipend. We are a part-time board and should not be taking money out of the taxpayer's pocket, my pocket, your pocket, and the pockets of our parents of students to give ourselves an increase in stipend. Thirdly, as you can see from the research prepared by NASB that is in your packet that we were given today, no other state in America pays their Board of Education members as much as we do. In many states, members have absolutely no compensation, and in others, they are only reimbursed for their expenses and travel. Every other state has many more LEAs, and the states are vastly larger than the District of Columbia. in response to an argument that was proposed that this increase will assist economically disadvantaged citizens to become engaged as public servants, I wholeheartedly disagree. As members, we currently all come from a range of economic backgrounds and continue to serve. I would not categorize any of our members as rich, and we still make time to serve our community and this city. Additionally, there are members who today have and who currently serve, and they use very little of their stipends by walking or riding their bicycles to perform their duties within the ward. Furthermore, as the at-large member of the board, my responsibilities carry me on a weekly basis across the entire city, not just in one ward, and I do not believe I've ever used the entirety of my $15,000. Whether this is an entitled as a cost of living increase, a salary increase, or simply a raise, doing so now in the wake of the numerous scandals that our city has been recently plagued with is, in my view, a fiscally irresponsible, bad optics, and frankly disappointing. In sum, this $4,080 can be put to better use. It should not be lining the pockets of our elected officials and is not in the best interest of taxpayers and the residents of District of Columbia. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Carter. I think I skipped a step, and I apologize. So you're welcome to chime back in after we have Mr. Hayworth describe the enhancement before us.
The DC State Board of Education is requesting the adjustment of Section 1-611.10 to mirror the cost of living provisions in Section 1-611.09. The compensation shall be subject to the cost of living increases, but not to step or other increases. For the purposes of this section, cost of living increases means the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers, published on January 1st of each year. The part-time elected members of the DC State Board of Education directly serve the residents of the District of Columbia. Since the creation of the State Board more than a decade ago, the salaries of these hardworking part-time public servants have not changed.
Thank you, Mr. Hayworth. We'll do some discussion, and we can come back to you again, Ms. Carter, if you'd like. Additional discussion? Mr. Weedon?
So I don't disagree with my at-large colleague. We do need to ensure that all our money is, as much as we can, going to our children, to the students. We need to put students first. As we've seen with at-risk funding, as we've seen with other media reports around spending within our schools, this isn't happening. Part of our duty is ensuring and working to make sure our taxpayer dollars are spent responsibly. I, for one, spend much more on my official duties than the $15,000 due to daycare and other things, or childcare, babysitters, other things, or have over the years before my children were old enough to be left alone. I also tend to walk to and from meetings because I have the availability to do that. Moving to a reimbursement or other system, I think, promotes values that are not DC values, driving and congestion. I would much prefer the flat stipend so that we're all on a level playing field. I don't think it's a burden on taxpayers. That said, I also would like to know, and I'd ask the staff to look into this, what are the staffing and other duties for other boards across the country? I don't think it's fair to compare us to other boards when we don't have a full picture of what their obligations are and what their staffing of those offices are. We need to do more to ensure that we're not compensated appropriately, but that our expenses are being met and that we're able to do the duties that we've been elected to do.
Thank you, Mr. Weedon. Do other board members have comments? I have a couple of points then that I'll make, and we will do, then I'll let Ms. Carter close if she'd like to, and we will go to a roll call vote on this. First, the argument, I agree, the argument that we're earning the same as we are for the same work is not true. We're actually earning less than our colleagues who served on this body were 10 and a half, 11 years ago when this body was created, because there have been no cost of living increases. And I would argue we're doing much more work than previous boards were doing. There was a very long time that OSSE did the majority of our work, and we simply showed up to vote. And OSSE put together our agenda, and OSSE called our witnesses, and OSSE presented us with an agenda, and we just banged the gavel and talked into these microphones. That is no longer the case. We all do a heck of a lot of work. We're also very fortunate that all of us that are currently on the body do have the time to serve, as Ms. Carter said. But there are a lot of folks in our community who have a lot to give, who don't have time to serve when they're not being compensated at a valued level. We have a lot of economically disadvantaged members of our community, and not having a stipend leads to a lack of opportunity for service. When I was at the very far end of the dais, actually the very last person on the dais, I moved in only when my colleague from Ward 8, who's now a council member, resigned because he couldn't afford to live on this salary and needed a full-time job, and so resigned his position, and I moved up one. There are a lot of folks in our community who have a heck of a lot to give, who would be more engaged and would run for these positions if they knew that their time was valued. Mr. Weedon already made the child care argument, and there are major events going on in this city. There are major times when leaders need to go and speak out. One of those was yesterday or the day before, when there was a rally against the ICE raids on us, a sanctuary city that protects and values our immigrant community. And I saw a lot about it on social media, and I wasn't able to go because I had to work, and I've got a flexible job. There are education-related issues that happen in this city and that have national impact that we should be leading on, and we can't because most of us have day jobs. So I think this is a very modest and responsible and reasonable increase that we're asking for. Additional comments? Mr. Jones?
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to echo some of your comments. I'm the only board member that served on the newly created State Board of Education. And Mr. Jacobson, you are absolutely correct. When we started, we had 2 employees from OSSE. And they were on loan, actually. We didn't have budget responsibility. We didn't really prepare our agenda. We didn't have the Office of the Ombudsman. We didn't have the Office of the Student Advocate. We really didn't have committees, quite frankly. And as far as the $15,000, now I want to be clear. I'm not running again, so I won't benefit from it. But I think it's important that we value the persons that serve. I donate well in excess of the $15,000 to children, to families, and schools in my community through book bags and school supplies and other needs and Thanksgiving turkeys every year. I've given, and it's documented, quite frankly. So, and I'm not saying every board member has to do that, but as Mr. Jacobson said, I was a part of the board when our other Ward 8 colleague had to leave because he couldn't afford to serve any longer. I believe it is a modest increase. I'm fiscally conservative up and down. There are very few people who are more conservative than I am when it comes to money. And I believe our elected officials should be responsible, but this is not an irresponsible act. And it's a modest request, and I believe it's overdue.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Ms. Carter, do you have any closing comments?
Just that we, in regards to extra staff and added responsibilities, unlike other states, I mean, we need to realize and recognize that we are the State Board of Education, not a school board, and whether or not, and all state boards of education work on similar issues, on issues of policy that affect students in their state. We also need to, in regards to the argument made that we are doing more work now than we were in previous years. Unfortunately, we cannot talk to the fact that perhaps in the past they were working on the status quo, and maybe we should be doing more and more work. Again, we are public servants. That means we serve the community and we are in service to the community. I do not believe that we should be having $15,000 pay to begin with. I do recognize that there can be a need for childcare. However, I think all members of this board would always recognize that you can bring, kids are welcome in all meetings at our board level and should be welcome at all of our events. Again, we work on policy issues. We going to rallies, and while that is maybe interesting and something that we want to do, I do not believe that those specific rallies are necessary to the work of policy of our board. Again, I think this is fiscally irresponsible, and I propose that we do not vote for it.
Thank you, Ms. Carter. On that, I'll ask Ms. Wilson-Phelan.
I think I just want to point out that this is a cost of living increase on $15,000. So the things that people are raising, I think it's a total of $3,000 to $4,000 that would happen over the course of 1 or 2 years or something. And I also am not running again, so I wouldn't serve to benefit from this. However, that said, this is a vote of principle. And what I would say is, I don't think either of these approaches is correct, right? It's either, if we are required and believe we should be doing more work, this is either a fully compensated role or it's not. And so I think this sort of not exactly middle of the ground approach of a $15,000 stipend, which can enable and free up some time and cover costs related to childcare and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know, I just feel like we're not really addressing the root cause here in either case. Like, this isn't about how you spend your money or how you spend your money or whether it should cover this or that. It's sort of like a very strange stipend that would never cover the cost of living in Washington, D.C., but kind of gives you a nod that some of your time is compensated. And so I'm not really sure that 3% on $15,000 solves anything. I would rather have a conversation about whether these are fully compensated roles and what that would look like. And in the meantime, I tend to agree that I don't see a fiscally responsible reason to increase that $15,000. It is not going to make or break whether someone can serve on this board in this city, given the cost of living today. So I personally am just going to oppose it because I don't, for those reasons. I think it's the wrong question. And I feel like our conversation up here just sort of went in very strange directions. So I wanted to just say that for the record, I tend to agree. Let's either solve the problem or not approve it. But these incremental kinds of shifts that don't really fix anything can lead towards a pathway that that doesn't build support for the board.
Fair enough. Thank you, Ms. Wilson-Phelan. With that, I'll call the yeas and nays. Mr. Hayworth, will you call the roll? And again, bear with us. We've got two of our members voting electronically.
Ms. Williams.
Yay.
Mr. Jacobson.
Aye.
Ms. Carter.
Nay.
Ms. Wilson-Phelan.
No.
Ms. Wattenberg. Dr. Woodruff. Dr. Woodruff. Mr. Jones.
Yay.
Mr. Weedon.
Abstain.
Mr. Batchelor. Mr. Batchelor. Mr. President, the ayes are 4, the nays are 2, the motion passes.
Thank you. We now move on to our vote and discussion on credit recovery in the District of Columbia. The superintendent has submitted emergency and proposed regulations that would establish, for the first time, statewide rules for the use of credit recovery programs in the District of Columbia. The State Board has reviewed the regulations in multiple working sessions and received testimony at our June public meeting from residents, educators, and both DC Public Schools and the Public Charter School Board. Credit recovery is a valuable tool for educators and administrators that creates an alternative pathway and new instructional opportunities for students facing challenges in school. But credit recovery programs cannot and should not be used to replace the rich and rigorous learning experience that is available only within a classroom. Doing so shortchanges the efforts of school leaders and teachers to motivate, educate, and inspire students. The State Board's authority on regulatory approval is limited. We are permitted to vote in favor or against regulations, not to amend. The State Board does this through resolutions. Tonight's debate will occur in 2 rounds. Each member is entitled to speak for 3 minutes in each round. At this time, I would welcome a motion on Resolution 18-6.
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Wilson Phelan. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Ms. Carter. The motion being properly moved and seconded, I will ask Mr. Hayworth to read the resolution into the record.
State Board of Education resolution to promulgate emergency and proposed rulemaking on credit recovery, SR 18-6. Whereas the Office of the State Superintendent of Education oversaw an investigation in January 2018 to examine graduation and attendance in District of Columbia high schools, and as part of that investigation engaged Alvarez and Marsal to examine policy adherence and supporting grade and graduation data in District of Columbia public school high schools. Whereas A&M, Alvarez and Marsal, in its portion of the final report, recommended that credit recovery programs be reconciled with the 120 seat-hour requirement, which must be done through regulation. Whereas pursuant to DC Code 38-2602B7, OSSE shall issue rules to establish requirements to govern acceptable credit to be granted for studies completed at an independent, private, public charter schools, and private instruction. Whereas pursuant to DC Code 38-2652A1, the DC State Board of Education advises the State Superintendent of Education on educational matters, including state regulations proposed by the mayor or the Superintendent of Education, and specifically approves high school graduation requirements. Whereas high school graduation requirements are based on the Carnegie Unit, which is the equivalent of 120 hours of instructional time. Whereas credit recovery offers students an opportunity to make up credits if they are off track to graduate due to failing a course. Whereas the regulations OSSE has proposed establish a statewide definition of credit recovery and provide parameters to local education agencies for how they may use credit recovery programming in District of Columbia schools. Whereas OSSE presented proposals and draft regulatory language to the State Board of Education in working and public sessions in April, May, and June 2018, and incorporated State Board member and public feedback in the regulatory proposal affixed to this resolution. And whereas OSSE believes it is necessary that regulations are in place for the start of the 2018-2019 school year. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the State Board approves the publication of emergency rulemaking on credit recovery with the regulatory proposal affixed to this resolution in the District of Columbia Register in order to provide schools and students with a framework of operation while the regulatory process continues. Be it further resolved that the State Board approves the publication of proposed rulemaking on credit recovery with the regulatory proposal affixed to this resolution in the DC Register for a public comment period of no less than 30 days. And be it finally resolved that prior to promulgation of final regulations in the DC Register, OSSE shall return to the State Board of Education for discussion, input, and a final approval vote.
Thank you, Mr. Hayworth. Is there discussion on the resolution before us? Ms. Wilson Phelan?
Thank you. I want to share just a few thoughts related to both our authority, the opportunities before us, and how I see our responsibility as a state entity. there are limits to what we can approve appropriately so when it comes to the specifics around the content of a particular class. We keep our authority at the level of approving standards for learning, and we don't strive to approve any set of curriculum. And in fact, that kind of respect for school-based and LEA-based knowledge is reflected in the competency-based education standards that were passed by the board about 2 years ago. At the same time, we learned from the Marshall and Alvarez report, various town halls that were convened by Education Committee Chair Grasso and the work of the High School Graduation Requirements Task Force, that the approach that this district is taking to learning is not working for the vast majority of our students. In fact, if we look at PARCC scores, which we on this board have approved as a way of predicting and being able to anticipate whether we're appropriately preparing students for next steps in life, we know that for high school students, only 20% have passed as proficient for English language arts and 13% for mathematics in 2017. That's not even a majority. So it's incumbent upon us as the state authority to consider other ways of approaching learning. The competency-based education requirements represent one such way that was agreed by the State Board of Education, that had opportunities for public comment that were extensive, that were fueled and informed by a task force that included public representatives from various agencies across the city, including school officials, all of the agencies responsible for education in the city, et cetera. And we did that through a regular process to ensure that there were rigor and the alternatives that we would consider as a city to earning credit rather than just through a regular 120 hours sit in a class, which is what the requirement said before competency-based education was a pathway. The regulations before us have been carefully and thoughtfully reviewed, I would say, by all of us. We've asked a set of questions, and I have appreciated how OSSE has responded to those and has done their best to put something forward that they think represents the best interests of the agencies responsible for education. I think I would question whether they represent the best interests of our students using the information that we have today related to how we are not preparing our students for next steps in life. We know this. We didn't need a whole set of news coverage to tell us that, but it certainly woke us up. Our regular system is not working for our students, and it's our responsibility to think differently. I oppose these regulations because they don't do enough to address the problems that we know exist. And yes, they address the lack of consistency across our system, but consistent application of something that doesn't work does more harm than good. And so I encourage us to take our full responsibility to nudge the system to take approaches that will personalize learning for our students. And I'll speak more about this on the second round.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson-Phelan. Any additional discussion at this time? Mr. Weedon.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to echo my colleague's statement. I believe that we are failing far too many students. I'll repeat that 20% of our students are proficient on PARCC and ELA, 13% math. We look at the percentage of students who need remedial education when they go to college. These are our graduates. We're not doing enough to ensure that they're meeting the standards that we set. I am not comfortable with these regulations because I don't feel assured that they're establishing a solid floor for our school systems and our LEAs. We need to make sure that our students are learning. We need to be more creative, and we need to find a path forward that best supports all students, proves mastery, and allows them to succeed, be it in college or career.
Thank you, Mr. Weedon. Additional discussion? If not, I have an amendment I'd like to offer with my colleagues, Ms. Woodruff and Mr. Weedon. The resolution will call amendment number 1. It's in your packet. It is an amendment that would delete everything and replace it with a new resolution that I'm going to ask. If I get a second, I'll ask Mr. Hayworth to read into the record.
Second.
Second by Ms. Wilson Phelan. Mr. Hayworth, would you please read the amendment into the record?
In line 3, delete everything after SR 18-6 and insert the following. Whereas in November 2017, media widely reported on the District of Columbia Public Schools DCPS abuse and disregard of its credit recovery regulations. Whereas the Office of the State Superintendent of Education oversaw an investigation in January 2018 to examine graduation and attendance in District of Columbia high schools, which included examination of the district's credit recovery policies. Whereas in January 2018, the State Board of Education initiated requests that OSSE engage with the State Board to work cooperatively to enact robust and rigorous credit recovery regulations through regular order. Whereas OSSE began engagement with the State Board on implementing credit recovery regulations in April 2018, necessitating an emergency rulemaking for the rule to take effect for the 2018-2019 school year. Whereas emergency rulemaking limits public input and creates uncertainty for local education agencies that must comply with an emergency rule and with a final rule which may undergo significant changes based on public comment. Whereas at the State Board's June 20 public meeting, witnesses on behalf of both the Public Charter School Board and the District of Columbia Public Schools testified that they will have improved policies in place regarding credit recovery courses for the 2018-2019 school year. Whereas the State Board believes students benefit from a tailored approach to education that ensures a student demonstrates mastery of a subject through earned grade, final exam, or other rigorous assessment. Whereas the State Board is concerned that credit recovery courses may lack rigor and may not provide a student with the opportunity to pursue learning opportunities that match his or her learning style and pace and with the knowledge necessary to master a subject. Whereas, and it is critical that students for whom traditional courses that have not enabled the student to master the course material be provided with opportunities that are equally rigorous but differentiated in the learning approach and pace to master course content through credit recovery. Whereas credit recovery regulations should provide enrollment and coursework data that policymakers and the public can use to analyze the veracity and rigor of coursework and ensure students master state standards that allow them to successfully pursue post-graduation opportunities. Whereas in 2016, the district enacted DCMR 2203.7, which established a clear path for students to earn credit through a mechanism other than the traditional Carnegie unit. Whereas DCMR 2203.7 was enacted after thorough community engagement, the convening of a task force, rigorous research, and a thoughtful regulatory process conducted through regular order. And whereas the State Board believes emergency regulations should only be promulgated when there is insufficient time for robust research and public engagement, and that regular order is preferable to students, policymakers, and LEAs who must follow regulations and to the public who experience the impact of the public education policy. Now therefore be it resolved that the State Board does not approve the publication of emergency rulemaking on credit recovery with the regulatory proposal affixed to this resolution in the District of Columbia Register. Be it further resolved that the State Board does not approve the publication of proposed rulemaking on credit recovery with the regulatory proposal affixed to this resolution in the DC Register. Be it further resolved that the State Board urges OSSE to issue guidance to LEAs on the need for and system to report data on the use of credit recovery in the 2018-2019 school year to OSSE, and that OSSE make the data collected public. Be it further resolved that the State Board requests that OSSE continue to work collaboratively with the State Board to promulgate revised credit recovery regulations through regular order on a timeline that ensures that students benefit from promulgated and approved statewide credit recovery regulations in the 2019-2020 school year. Be it further resolved that credit recovery regulations should follow the rule established for alternatives to the Carnegie unit established in DCMR 2203.7 to ensure rigor and oversight of credit recovery courses and to align the district's alternatives to the Carnegie unit. Be it further resolved that the regulations include amendments to DCMR 2203.7 that incorporate the recently passed recommendations of the High School Graduation Task Force related to providing students with opportunities to earn credit through assessments that demonstrate mastery of state standards in math and world language, and 2, reduction of the required community service hours to 50 hours. Be it further resolved that the regulations include a mechanism for publicly reporting credit recovery unit data, including student attendance at and enrollment in a credit recovery course, a list of credit recovery course offerings, the timing and method for delivery of the course, and vendors providing credit recovery courses. Be it further resolved that the regulations include a monitoring and enforcement mechanism to ensure fidelity, and be it finally resolved that the regulations sunset after 3 school years, necessitating that OSSE, the State Board, LEAs, and the public may examine credit recovery data and to ensure that credit recovery regulations meet the needs of the district students.
Thank you, Mr. Hayworth. I'll just make 3 brief points on my proposed amendment and then open it up for other colleagues. First, my fiance is an emergency doctor. We had a conversation and he said to me, when people are in the emergency room, that's the worst day of their life. They're not really thinking clearly and they're not really necessarily acting in their best interests. Emergencies are just that, emergencies, and if you can avoid that, you should. I believe that as well. I think our council uses emergency legislation all too frequently, and I think there is regular order for a reason. I'd prefer to move our regulations through regular order. Second, this is important that LEAs have policies and follow those policies. We're here because DCPS had a policy but wasn't following it. We had a hearing last month. It was a month ago now. And we had a hearing and a representative from both DCPS and a representative from the Public Charter School Board came and testified that they have crafted and the Public Charter School Board has already approved improved regulations, improved policies rather, for credit recovery for the 2018-19 school year. DCPS also has. They want to align it with the proposal that the superintendent has made, and they can do that even without passing credit recovery regulations. The last piece is, Ms. Wilson-Phelan already hit on this. Let's start standardizing and streamlining some of our policies and regulations. I think the request that credit for credit beyond the Carnegie unit be treated similarly. I think that makes sense. I think it makes sure that there is rigor and there is oversight, and we've got a path that's working that we're already collecting data on. That is all I have at the moment. Anyone else want to speak on the amendment?
Yes.
Mr. Jones.
Mr. President, and this is a question to the proposers of the amendment. How does this impact the 2018-2019 school year for students? My concern, would your proposed amendment adversely impact our children in the school year?
That would be up to the LEAs. If they choose not to have robust, transparent credit recovery policies within the LEA, then the children in that LEA will suffer. But all of the charter schools will have to have improved policies in place for the 2018-19 school year. So that takes about half of our students out of harm's way. And DCPS has stated they can have a policy in place for the 2018-19 school year that will be improved and will protect the students who attend DCP public schools.
Just add that at the last hearing or the last meeting, both the charter sector and the DCPS sector representatives multiple times said the regulations as written would not change any of their behavior because this is the direction they're already heading anyway. They said that instead, what it would do if they were released now is allow them to ensure, especially DCPS said this, it would ensure that the policy they wrote is in alignment with what the state would issue as guidance. What stuck for me is that it would not change their behavior at all.
I know this has become a cliche, but I need to reclaim part of my time.
We will.
Okay.
Absolutely. That's it. Are you finished?
I can reclaim?
Please.
Yeah. So and none of us are amazed, at least I'm not, by the report that brought us to this place. And as my colleague from Ward 1 suggested on the earlier vote, you know, yes, we need to have a much larger discussion. And this was an opportunity in my mind for all the LEAs, the State Board, and OSSE to come together. And that did not happen. All too often in this city, we dig our heels in the sand because we all have developed different philosophies. But we're not focused on the outcome and the parties who are going to benefit or not benefit from our work and our decisions. So, you know, I don't know how I'm going to vote. I'm not sure if any of this resolves the problems that we're facing with credit recovery and moving our students. So with that, you know, I'm not sure whether the emergency is in place, and I certainly don't like emergencies, but I know there are times where they're necessary. So I just think this was a unique opportunity for all of us, and I think we all, and that includes me too, because I serve on this board. I think we all failed each other, and we failed our students because we could have had a much robust, more intense discussion and work to bring this forward. And this is an issue that has been impacting our children for I don't know how long. So with that, I just hope we can see some positive change for the families in this city. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. I'll just interject one piece that is in the amendment regarding emergency. The emergency is necessitated by the late date at which we received this proposal. If we had engaged earlier, all of the policymakers had engaged earlier and had discussions earlier, this could have gone through regular order and negated the need for emergency regulation. Additional comments or discussion? Ms. Carter.
I just want to say that I mirror several of my colleagues' comments, especially my colleague from Ward 1. We've seen last month that there are already DCPS and PCSB working on credit recovery. This emergency resolution, I think, is a step in the right direction, but I believe it was a little rushed and it doesn't go far enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Carter. Additional discussion? Mr. Weedon?
Thank you. I agree with everything that's been said, especially my colleague from Ward 5. I don't see an emergency here. As Ms. Wilson-Phelan said, this regulation is not going to change practice at the LEA level. I question whether or not we need to change practice at the LEA level. There are times where we, as policymakers, need to push policy that will force change. We've gone through the statistics. Far too many of our kids are not graduating prepared for the challenges ahead of them. We need to change policy to change outcomes. I don't see this as raising the bar and changing those practices. And that's what I hope to work on over the coming months and coming weeks as we get this right.
Thank you, Mr. Weedon. Any more discussion on the amendment? If not, I'd like to call the roll. Mr. Hayworth. And again, bear with us as we have two electronic colleagues.
The motion is on approval of the Jacobson, Weedon, and Woodruff amendment to SR 18-6. Ms. Williams.
Abstain.
Mr. Jacobson.
Aye.
Ms. Carter.
Aye.
Ms. Wilson-Phelan.
Aye.
Ms. Wattenberg.
Aye.
Dr. Woodruff is absent, excuse me. Mr. Jones.
Aye.
Mr. Weedon.
Aye.
Mr. Batchelor. Mr. Batchelor. Mr. President, the amendment is approved.
Thank you. And now I'd like to move on final discussion and approval of the final resolution. Any additional discussion? Ms. Wilson-Phelan.
I just want to finish the statement I had started earlier. So I will also throw out there, competency-based education is not proven. The states that have moved furthest forward with this are still evaluating its effect. There are open questions about whether this is appropriate in an urban setting where the vast majority of students are not on grade level when they enter high school. But what we do know is that 120 hours in a classroom, with the approach to learning being uniformly the same for all students, is definitely not working. It doesn't match what this learning style is of today's students. That doesn't mean that teachers aren't trying their best to differentiate and meet the needs of individual students in classrooms. I'm sure that is happening in a widespread manner. But what we do know is that students learn in lots of different ways and have lots of different needs, especially students that have fewer resources at home financially, who have to take care of younger siblings, who have to work. Our system should be adapting to the needs of those students and families without sacrificing learning. And we need to be encouraging the system to move in that way. And my feeling is, and I'm open to a conversation about this, and this is why we want to push back the regulation to have that conversation, is that if there are 15% of students in credit recovery, which is the statistic that was shared with us by DCPS last week, it's an opportunity for 15% of those students to be using different approaches to learning and to gradually shift the system to be trying this. It's actually a really unique opportunity for the state to be shifting expectations and providing space for LEAs to draw out and think through what a competency-based approach to education would look like without upsetting the entire apple cart, which would be disastrous for our city. And so I feel really responsible as a member of the State Board of Education to be encouraging the system to try those new approaches and to do it in a responsible, incremental way. And so I'm not saying competency-based education is the only way. I'm not saying it's definitely proven. That would be irresponsible. We do not have the data to support that. But it is something we should be trying and something we should be encouraging. We should not be making students sit through 120 hours of a course even if they know halfway through it that they have already failed. That is exactly what these regulations require a student to do. That is not acceptable. That is just going to continue to push students out of the system.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson-Phelan. Seeing no other members interested in speaking, we will call the roll on final passage.
The motion is on approval of SR 18-6 as amended. Ms. Williams. Ms. Williams. Mr. Jacobson.
Aye.
Ms. Carter.
Aye.
Ms. Wilson-Phelan.
Aye.
Ms. Wattenberg.
Aye.
Dr. Woodruff is absent. Mr. Jones.
Aye.
Mr. Weedon.
Aye.
Mr. Batchelor. Mr. Batchelor. Mr. President, the motion carries.
Thank you, and thank you to the superintendent and her team. We look forward to continuing this discussion and our work with you on this issue. Let me see where we are in my notes. High school graduation requirements recommendations. Public comment. We're going to go back to public comment because I believe that Ms. Brown has arrived. Going to do a quick 3-minute public comment and then move to the rest of our discussion. As we said earlier, public comment is welcome at each of our meetings, and folks can sign up at SBOE at dc.gov or by calling 202-741-0888. We have Ms. Carrie Brown, volunteer tutor at Horton's Kids with us. Thank you so much for taking time this evening.
Thanks for having me. I'm here today to share my views about community service hours required in DC to graduate from high school, and about the State Board's recommendation that they be reduced from 100 to 50 hours beginning with the class of 2023. I ask that you consider reducing the number further and making the community service something that can be completed within the school day or eliminate the requirement altogether. I also ask that you begin these changes as soon as possible. I'm here today as a volunteer who over the past decade has helped several teens living in Ward 8 prepare to graduate from high school and come up with a plan for college and career. During this time, I've concluded that the service requirement that all students must complete hurts the most vulnerable students in DC. The service requirement seems to me like a well-meant program designed to teach students about being involved members of a community. In the interest of time, I won't go through all the positives, but I assure you I'm aware of the positive things that come out of it: skill development, getting to know other people, all that sort of thing. But there are too many downsides to the program in its current form. The kids I work with are people in need. At one time or another, many of the students I've worked with have experienced homelessness or otherwise fought hard to simply have their most basic needs met. I can't help but think volunteering to serve others is not in the best use of their time. Many of these students live in poverty, have children of their own, or have family responsibilities that prevent them from having control over their schedules and being able to make plans to volunteer. They often have to work outside their home to make financial contributions to their family. As a result, completing such a large number of service hours simply can't be a priority. Here are some of my recommendations and conclusions based on my experience. 100 hours of service is too many. 50 is also too many. It's a lot to do and it's a lot to track. Reduce the number of service hours to between 10 and 25. Require that schools make service learning a part of the school day. Ensure that students are able to participate in choosing and planning the service projects. Aligning service learning with areas of interest to students makes it a more meaningful experience. Count hours spent planning those projects. Develop a better system for tracking that is easy, fast, and accurate. Don't require students to find service hours themselves. It's very difficult to find service hours in large quantities. I've looked at the options on the DCPS website that gives service opportunities, and many of the organizations listed require kids to commit to volunteering months out for a 2-hour shift, and that's not realistic. Additionally, many of the recommended organizations require people to be 17 or 18, and if not, they require a parent to be there with the students. This is a huge obstacle for the kids I work with, as their parents are not able to accompany them to do their service hours. An immediate step should be to update this site with service hour opportunities that all high school students can complete without parent involvement or long waiting periods. Organizations organize projects with large amounts of service hours during the weeks of the summer when the summer youth employment program is not taking place. Provide funding for students who want to plan their own project. Volunteering often requires supplies, and kids from lower income families are at a disadvantage in this regard. The kids I work with are doing service to others instead of service to themselves. I'm working with a kid currently who has grades to get into college, but is literally volunteering instead of doing SAT prep, visiting colleges, and writing essays. In closing, I ask that you consider that when students are required to complete 50 to 100 hours of service, the following outcomes are possible. Students give up getting their high school degree. Students don't spend as much time researching college and career options. And hopeful students don't apply for as many scholarships due to time constraints, and they may not be able to afford going to college as a result. Free time is limited, and completing service to others instead of getting ready for college and career and life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Brown. Questions from board members? Ms. Carter.
Ms. Brown, thank you very, very much for your comments along these issues. We spoke as board members on this exact issue in working sessions several times over the course of many months, and I echo your recommendations and a lot of your comments today. I pushed strongly for service learning in the district, and my colleagues who worked on the task force can update you later on some of the reasons why they chose not to. But again, thank you very, very much for your comments, and I hope to support you and Horton's kids in your future endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you.
Did you want to respond at all?
No, I mean, I agree, and I have a lot more to say. This is literally something I've been thinking about for 10 years since I started doing this, and have been frustrated. And it makes me sad that I'm not visiting colleges with a kid, because I'm doing service for kids in Jamaica, Jamaican orphanages with her, instead of getting ready for college. And she's not right now on track to get to college, and that's not in her best interest. And so I grew up in Fairfax County, and I did a lot of service, and I think that this is a great thing for kids from my position, but kids who are hardly making it to school in the first place. We're talking about credit recovery and people who don't get to class. To add this burden onto people, it's too much. And the other thing I'll say about the tracking of it, what I've seen from a couple different schools is like the tracking burden of doing this is kind of a mess. And it's like you submit these hours on paper, and then eventually somebody puts it into a system, and there's no like live update as to where you are. Your kids are responsible for making sure that it gets put in there, but they have to keep checking back with their guidance counselor. It just seems like not a great system. And if you're going to require it, put a system, an electronic system in place so that this is a lot easier for everyone to do. I mean, it just seems like if you are going to require this and this is that important, then put some things in place to make it happen. The other thing is 100 hours your senior year is a lot. So yes, I understand people should be doing this 25 hours at a time, but if that's not being enforced or focused on, like you're really failing kids. And in junior and senior year, they just don't have the time to do this. And I feel like it's something that could be a huge obstacle mentally if you're on the borderline of passing, and then there's this thing, And I'll also say, I talk to kids and say, how do you get this done? And one kid told me, well, I volunteered at a camp 1 week and I got 135 hours. And I said, that's not possible to get 135 hours in 1 week. And they're like, yeah, well, that's what they give you for it. So I feel like a lot of these hours are kind of fraud. And so that's not fair to the kids who are doing it all. So if people aren't really doing it, then, change the project and make it meaningful and make it real.
Thank you. We might have one more minute. Any other board questions or comments? Ms. Wilson-Phelan.
I would just say that's great. There were a number of diverse voices on that board, so 50 ended up being the compromise position. But I really appreciate your perspective that you're bringing to the table. I'm glad it's in the record, and I hope everybody's listening.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for your time and for your advocacy and for spending so much time with our students.
Sure.
Now we're going to get back to high school graduation requirement recommendations. The state board tasked 2 of our members, Laura Wilson-Phelan of Ward 1 and Marcus Batchelor of Ward 8, to lead one of the most transparent and diverse task forces in the city's history for an ambitious review of the district's graduation requirements. The 3 recommendations, permitting credit for mastery of math and world languages, reducing community service requirements, and creating a personalized learning plan for each public school student in the district, were adopted by the state board in May. We've been working with our partners at OSSE to move these recommendations into regulations. As part of that process, we have invited 4 of the task force participants and 3 national experts to join us and present testimony related to mastery credit recommendation of the task force. Witnesses this evening will have 5 minutes each, followed by a round of questions from board members. As I call your name, please come to the witness table. Dwan Jordon, head of schools at KIPP DC. Carla Reid-Witt, high school parent at Banneker Academic High School. Cara Fuller, principal, DCPS Ballou Stay High School. And Cosby Hunt, senior officer of teaching and learning at the Center for Inspired Teaching. Thank you all for being here. We'll begin on your left, my right.
Good evening. My name is Dwan Jordon. I'm a native Washingtonian who was raised by a single mom here in the district. I am a DCPS graduate, attended Whittier Elementary, Paul Junior High, and Coolidge Senior High School. I have received credits in my undergrad years at the University of District of Columbia before matriculating. I did obtain a master's from Trinity University, worked as an educator in the public and charter sectors in the district. I served John Philip Sousa, Cesar Chavez Friendship, and now serve as the head of schools for KIPP DC. I have children who attended Tacoma, Dale, and Banneker, and my youngest daughter is currently a rising 8th grader at Tacoma. I'm providing testimony today not as a representative of any particular school, but instead as a father and an educator who has served students, parents, and communities as a school leader in Ward 7 and Ward 8. I have experienced education in the nation's capital in a different way. I've worked with students who received full scholarships to some of the best schools in the nation and students who passed AP classes and entered college as sophomores. On the other end of the spectrum, I've worked with students who were many grade levels behind, students on the verge of dropping out of school for many reasons, and students who were passed along because no one took the time to truly educate them. I've parented self-motivated, incredibly advanced students and students who care more about humans and their plight, who needed an extra push and motivation from me, their school, and the school system to ensure that they were proficient. Schools are responsible for providing remediation, enrichment, and acceleration for each of their students. As a teacher and a school leader, I always wanted to ensure that my classroom and schools were providing all students with learning experiences that fit their individual needs. All students do not learn the same way, and we have to ensure that we are setting up our schools to value all students and their learning experiences. Particularly in math and world language classes, students should be allowed to demonstrate what they know and to receive credit for that knowledge without requiring that they learn that information in only one setting through sitting for 120 hours in a classroom. Currently, students who take world language courses outside of those offered by their school have a difficult time receiving credit for what they know. Furthermore, students who enter high school already demonstrating mastery in world language do not have a way to receive credit for what they already know. And finally, many students building knowledge in a class setting does not work best for their learning style. So by enabling students to receive credit by demonstrating mastery beyond sitting in the class, the district acknowledges the many ways in which students learn. In my opinion, also as far as community service hours, grade schools develop plans of action and clear, flexible pathways and roadmaps for all of its students to be successful. A great example of this is when I worked with a network that charted the course through meaningful learning experiences for students to obtain their community service hours through school programming and internships in which they had to interview for each year. The students did not have trouble finding meaningful community service experiences in which to participate, and for students who needed to work for money, the requirement was less of a burden. Unfortunately, all local agencies may not have the capacity to take this task on. So reducing the required hours from 100 to 50 would allow students to spend more time doing paid work, pursuing meaningful internships, or participating in meaningful extracurricular activities. And lastly, I mentioned my youngest daughter earlier. She is the student that would have gotten lost in the system if she didn't have a father who was an educator. She's kind, sweet, charismatic, and a joy to have in class. However, she has been a student that needed support and interventions. When I received her test scores indicating that she was not performing on grade level, I immediately jumped into action doing all that I could do to get her the assistance that she needed. I noticed that her school had some intervention programs in place, but that wasn't enough for her, and as a father, I wasn't satisfied. I wanted to be sure that she was receiving the interventions and support she needed so that she would be successful in school and ready to succeed in college. All students do not have an educator as a mother or father. Parents may not have the resources to get their students the help they need to strengthen their weaknesses. In some cases, parents are not aware of their students' gaps and/or may not know how to help their student overcome the gaps. Many school networks have plans that use available data to help students get to grade level, stay on grade level, or exceed grade level. They identify and execute high-impact interventions that help students grow more proficient and ultimately improve student outcomes. We have to ensure that all schools have the means and resources to identify and execute high-impact interventions with fidelity. Some of our current schools have these types of interventions in place, and the data shows that their students are matriculating to college and career at a higher rate. In closing, I'm aware that we have to consider school capacity, implicit bias, adequate funding and resources, and commitment as real obstacles that would have to be addressed to ensure that these recommendations are implemented. As a parent and an educator, I believe that we have to do whatever it takes to ensure that our scholars get to and through college, and that these are a few important steps that we can take in that pursuit.
Thank you. Ms. Reid-Witt?
Thanks. Hi, my name is Carla Reid-Witt. I'm a DCPS parent. My daughter attends Banneker, and I was a member of the task force. Our graduation requirements are like a chokehold on our kids, a one-size-fits-all system that doesn't fit any of our kids, from the most challenged to the most resourced. The recommendations of the graduation task force is the first step in the creation of graduation requirements which can flex to the needs of our very diverse community of students, leading them to all achieve in high school education, which will prepare them to be the thinkers in the knowledge economy. First, I want to talk about the community service hours reduction. Theoretically, community service requirements should help students to become active members of their community. And 100 hours sounds like a good round number. However, overall community service for our kids is far from a fulfilling experience. It's onerous for many of our kids and an annoyance, a check off for most of the other kids. We've substituted quantity for quality, and we've ignored challenges that our diverse community of kids face inside and outside of school. In most cases, we provide no support for community service. Students are just supposed to make it happen. We have kids who have extra challenges at home, kids who work, students with physical disabilities, students with mental health challenges, students with chronic illnesses, and the list goes on. We have to have a community service goal that's reasonably achievable for our students, and we need to provide support. And I have some ideas about how we can support students, if I can answer in the question portion. Next, I want to talk about the personalized learning plans. Our schools plan for long-term success for all students, but we actually only plan short-term for individual students. Every year is isolated. A new teacher, new data, where does the student fall, what is the growth for the year? Personalized plans will cue students, parents, and schools to the big picture. Individualized planning for high school graduation needs to start long before high school. We need early intervention. Lower grade elementary school parents need to know if their students are on track for higher grade elementary. Higher grade elementary school parents need to know that their kids are on track for middle school. This will cue parents, students, and schools to the level of intervention necessary for students to catch up before things pile up. 8th grade plans will cue students to their status before they get to high school. Report cards do not give this kind of cue and can actually be misleading. And the PARC, which expresses performance on the basis of college readiness, really has no meaning to a 3rd grade parent. All students should receive personalized plans, including those with IEPs. IEPs are annual short-term plans and only cover specific areas. Regarding the math and language testing, this will allow students to meet graduation requirements, not waste precious learning time sitting in classes for which they have mastered the subject matter, and to seek opportunity to expand in areas of interest or curiosity, or even to lighten their school load if need. This opportunity is open and accessible to all students, from the student who comes from the well-resourced family, to the student whose abuela taught her to read and speak Spanish, to the student who excels in math, but who's also diagnosed with dysgraphia, a writing disability. I support all three, and also the idea about even a reduction in the hours would be good for me, for the community service.
Thank you, Ms. Reid-Witt.
Oh, you got it.
And Ms. Fuller, you're next.
Good evening. I'm the principal of Ballou State. Ballou State is a Opportunity Academy school in DCPS that educates students 16 and over who have dropped out of high school for the second or third time. I definitely support all the recommendations that the task force is making to this body. While it was a very arduous task to find consensus amongst a diverse group of stakeholders, particularly given last year's tumultuous political and policy climate in the district. The recommendations that the task force put forward will greatly benefit current second chance students and in some cases prevent students from landing at the Opportunity Academies. Just this week, I had several experiences that highlights the need for systematic graduation reform. So an 18-year-old student who has 2 children that need to be picked up from school by 3 and works part-time does not have the capacity to obtain 100 hours community service the way it's currently defined. Yes, she should have completed 25 hours per year, but she was pregnant and eventually dropped out of school. The recommendation to reduce the requirements to 50 hours and allow increased flexibility for how a student can earn those hours levels the playing field and for how a student increases the likelihood that community service will be a true opportunity for exposure and experience and not a stumbling block. Allowing students to test out of math and foreign language courses to gain a car unit will increase flexibility and ownership. At Ballou State, when we implemented competency-based, mastery-based courses and stopped trying to orchestrate student learning experience for every student, students who may have struggled in the past became increasingly intrinsically motivated. While several staff members on the task force thought that this policy would be used primarily by affluent students, I think that this could be a great way to encourage all students. If this recommendation is voted into policy, I would want to ensure all students at all schools are aware of this opportunity. The personal learning plan is a recommendation that sparked the most controversy amongst task force members. I agree with the number of educators that the plan was an excellent idea and can foster more communication with parents and other stakeholders, but implementation will be difficult and could become perfunctory. The overall purpose of the plan is to aid students with post-secondary preparation by arming parents with relevant information. But I am more concerned with parents knowing the policies that relate to high school promotion and meeting high school requirements. Communicating with parents regarding post-secondary is a more complex process that should include the ever-evolving interests and ability of a student. As we know, students change their minds, like every day, regarding their next steps on a daily basis. PLPs seem fairly static and may not be the best tool for this process. Overall, I do believe that all 3 recommendations strive to multiply avenues for graduation for all students, and particularly those at Opportunity Academies. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fuller. And Mr. Hunt.
Good evening. Thank you for this opportunity to testify about the recommendations of the High School Graduation Requirement Task Force. My name is Cosby Hunt. I was a Ward 5 member of that task force. I have 17 years of experience teaching DCPS students, 8 years of coaching DCPS and charter school teachers, and I'm doing my best with my 9 and 10-year-old sons in our public schools. While there are 3 recommendations under consideration, and I support them all, I would like to concentrate my efforts on the 3rd one, implementation of personalized learning plans. Simply put, waiting until 9th grade to create a graduation plan for students is too late. As our city's 2016-17 Park scores tell us, fewer than 1/3 of our students in grades 3 through 8 are meeting or exceeding expectations in English language arts. That number is 29% in math. These numbers mean that a majority of our students are entering 9th grade ill-equipped to do high school work. The lack of preparedness to take on high school work is a major factor in the truancy and credit recovery debacle we witnessed last school year. So the idea is simple. Let's start making graduation plans for students earlier. Right now, there is only one conversation, one plan required, if it happens at all, and that is in 9th grade. Oh, there are plenty of informal conversations about the infamous packet, the bundle of work teachers are sometimes asked to throw together for 12th grade Johnny so that we can get him out the door and meet the 4-year graduation metrics. But those are the conversations we want to avoid. As you know, this proposal calls on schools to formally check in with students and their families about each student's path to graduation between grades 2 and 4, at the end of grade 5, and at the end of grade 8. Some people argue that we overtest our children. Perhaps, but I would argue that we underutilize the information we gain from the tests we give. As things stand right now, real estate agents make better use of the test scores than we do as parents, principals, and educators. How many fourth graders have discussed what their third grade PARCC scores say about their reading comprehension? Better to find out that a student is slightly behind in fourth grade and make a plan for improvement than to throw our hands up in 11th grade as we find out that she is reading at the 6th grade level. Better to learn that a student is ready to do 7th grade math at the end of 5th grade and make a plan for accelerated growth than to wonder in 10th grade why this bored, under-challenged student is acting out in class. When students own what their scores mean for them, they become powerful agents in their own learning. Yes, the devil will be in the details. How will schools decide who the members of these personalized learning plan teams will be? What will these plans actually look like? How will schools find time to talk to every family about students' scores? What are the budget implications of these personalized learning plans? These are not insignificant considerations, but I prefer these questions about how to solve problems to questions about how we found ourselves with the problems in the first place. If we want to hold our students to high expectations, we need to do a better job of preparing them to meet those expectations. Thank you for your time.
Well, I'll just say thank you all for your time. You invested an incredible amount of your personal time and energy. And on behalf of this board and on behalf of the students that we serve, I just thank you so very much for all of your time and for coming one last time here this evening. With that, we'll turn it over to my colleagues for discussion. Ms. Wilson-Phelan, did you want to start?
Actually, if someone else has burning questions, I've had the pleasure of spending a lot of time with these folks. And I do want to just say thank you. You're amazing. And thank you for coming back tonight. I don't take that lightly. And the thought you put into your testimony and preparing it after long days of work. So thank you again for your service.
Mr. Weedon.
I want to echo the thanks that we owe you for not just being here tonight, but for the months of service that you've provided and the work that you do each and every day. I want to just thank you, Mr. Hunt, for your comment about how we underutilize the info we receive from testing. I think that is absolutely true. That, to me, does not mean we need to get rid of the test, but that means that we need to find ways to better utilize the test. Looking at ways like the first few weeks of school, we don't have clear enrollment data. We don't know who's coming in many of our schools. We need to ensure that our systems are fixed so that the data is in the hands of educators much, much earlier than it currently is. I don't really have a question along those lines, but I'm very sympathetic to that. I do want to utilize my time to ask something about community service. It's something that's very near and dear to me. I've spent last Friday at Food and Friends with a group of 9 wonderful Eastern students. 2 weeks before that, we were out volunteering in the community at, I forgot where we were. Wasn't bred for the city. We're going there next week. Anyway, I spent much of my summers volunteering with the students. Many of the objections that we've heard about the 100 hours are around implementation. Tracking and data systems aren't adequate, the need to work and care for others in our family, lack of high-quality options, lack of support for students in the schools to find opportunities. If we cut this requirement from, and I'm sympathetic to all of those arguments, I think 100 hours is too much. I'm in support of moving it to 50. But even if we do that, how is this change going to impact the day-to-day for these students? Yes, they'll have to get fewer hours. It's still going to be the same bureaucratic nightmare. They're still not going to be supported. So what do we need to do to get the LEAs to better support students in their pursuit of this requirement?
So this school year, we are implementing a mentoring and personal learning time in our school because we are a competency-based school, and we know that a critical part to being competency-based is having students meet one-on-one to set goals and to think about short-term and long-term planning. And so because of the recommendations and the increased flexibility, we are now going to be able to use community service hours during that time in a way that we, and because it's 50 hours, it gives students an ability over the course of the year to actually achieve those hours during school time, doing something that will both include their own personal time, but each of those students will also have an opportunity to work on a community project while they're in that mentoring session. And that's something that I feel like we needed leverage in order. This is a good thing for our students, but we didn't have a carrot for it before. Like, it's very hard to get students to do things just because they're a good thing. As adults, we need other carrots. And so I think that the community service component at 50 hours gives us that flexibility to do that. The good thing that the student we know will have opportunity to get exposure to community and all these other great things. At 100 hours though, it's arduous for me, right? Like, I can't convince a student that this is an attainable goal. At 50, I can, and I can create opportunities that will be meaningful during the school day, which is critical for my students. It can't be after school.
And to add to that, the best practice that I've seen is when schools utilize the curriculum to really pull out experiences that support the curriculum to allow kids to achieve community service hours. So in a geography class or government class, you can actually have kids take up a cause and come to meetings like this and advocate for those causes,
right.
And receive their hours for that. It's in support of the curriculum. The teachers are working with kids.
So I would argue that increased flexibility is needed. I don't believe the state has a definition of community service right now that's done at the LEA levels, and Ms. Wilson-Phelan, you can correct me, or panelists can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not sure that the proposal that you put forward actually defines community service. It still leaves it up to the LEAs. So again, what we're doing is not necessarily changing practice. The LEAs have the authority to make these determinations, to include service learning, asking their students to come and testify before us and counting that towards their requirements. And I would love to see that. I think that needs to happen, but I don't see the recommendations necessarily pushing that. And I hope you'll continue to work with us so that we can better define what community service is, so that we can include all of these things. And I have 15 seconds left, so I just want to say this is not policy yet. We need OSSE to act. And I hope that OSSE is listening and moves those regulations to the board so that we can make the necessary changes and enact them into law.
Thank you, Mr. Weedon, and I share your thoughts on our colleagues at OSSE. I'm sure some of our team members and colleagues are watching, and we will follow up with them with all of the testimony that y'all have supplied us tonight. Ms. Carter.
Thank you very much for being here tonight, and thank you for your comments. My question revolves around the community service graduation requirements. It's something that throughout the updates for the past several months that I was keenly aware of and asked many questions to my colleagues, Marcus and Laura. My question for you guys though tonight is, I was the one who talked to Laura about potentially implementing service learning requirements in DC, mirrored after Maryland. When I was a student in Maryland public schools, I worked with Dr. Nancy Grasmick, and I was one of the students to help implement that regulation into Maryland graduation requirements. My question for you guys is, as task force members, why hour requirement, and why 50 hours as opposed to say 30 or 25, and why not moving towards the model of service learning? Why did you guys choose not to move towards that model? What are these students actually learning with community service hours as opposed to moving towards a preparation, action, and reflection model?
I like how you pointed at me on that one. I think we took the path of least resistance. I think given the time restraints and all the things on our plate, I think that we realized how daunting it might be to define community service, to define service learning, which I think all of us support. And we saw the hour reduction as a first step to perhaps a community service requirement that could be more meaningful, because I think we do all agree that service learning is an ideal. That's almost a task force project in and of itself.
I thought that our work was really productive, but it was hard fought. It really was, which I didn't expect. I actually thought we were going to have a lot more things that we would recommend. And I think that one thing we struggled with was what's the scope of our work. And a lot of times, so 50 hours was within the scope, but when you get more into the weeds, we weren't sure if that was something, you know, that maybe goes to content and maybe it's something that a LEA should decide for kids. But I actually think that the city can do some things to assist and maybe implement service, to provide opportunities for students that maybe don't come directly from the schools. I think we could do things like service learning days. You know, a school could take a day and have a project that they partner with someone to do for kids to provide opportunities. I mean, I think there are a lot of ways that we can do it, and I frankly think that our graduation requirements as they are written are too prescriptive. And, you know, perhaps if we go into service learning in the actual graduation requirements, we're really, you know, constricting what's possible for the students.
Listening to Carla reminds me that if I'm not mistaken, Banneker students need 270 community service hours to graduate, so they've got a system. It would behoove us to talk to them about how they do that with a requirement that's much higher than our city requirement.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Carter. Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just observation. But first of all, I want to thank you all for your commitment and your work, and I want to thank my colleagues for their commitment and their work. However, I'm asking you to remain vigilant and be prepared to reach out to OSSE. This is an area that has long disturbed me, that our works sometimes can fall on deaf ears. And we don't have the opportunity to present this and move forward. We can only request OSSE, as my other colleague has mentioned before, has that responsibility. I think my colleague from Ward 6 mentioned that. So without your willingness to continue and to engage OSSE and our other elected officials, not saying that your work is in vain, because it isn't, because there is much has been learned from this, but it's necessary. So I would encourage you to be prepared. If you need to make phone calls, write letters, and encourage the other leaders that this is important, that OSSE moves this piece. Otherwise, it's just a learning experience. And in reference to the service hours, Cosby, you're right. Banneker has done an exceptional job, but part of that is they do have a system, but they have motivated students and they have motivated parents. Those are key ingredients for education. It's always been my thought as an adult that children from affluent families or families with influence will always educate their children. They don't have a problem finding community service hours. because that's part of their network and their living. 500 hours wouldn't have been a problem for my children because that's how we live. But children that come from families that don't have access, who have not had the value of volunteerism, those are the families we need to help. And you're absolutely right. Where it may not be a problem for my children or these board members' children or Cosby, your children, but families that don't have access, 25 hours is a lot. So we've got to take all of that into consideration. But lastly, thank you for your time.
Ms. Wilson-Phelan.
You all were so great at sharing and supporting the task force's ideas today before the board, and I know that some of you held individualized opinions about some of our recommendations. As the board moves in, and if you weren't following the resolution that was just passed by the board, 2203.7 refers to the regulations that allow for competency-based education. And essentially the board just made a statement saying that we're not satisfied with business as usual. We want credit recovery to look more like competency-based education. And we want to see the regulations, the first to the 50 hours and the ability to earn credit through assessment, to come back to the board. I'm curious, given you are here, and this is a great opportunity also for our colleagues who aren't here, some of whom have opposed pieces of our recommendations, to go on the record saying what you actually just individually as educators and as a parent think about both the assessment for credit, especially for full credit. So right now on the table, as you know, our consensus point was you could get full credit for the full 6 credits if you pass and demonstrate mastery over foreign language and math. I mean, the likelihood of any student doing that is slim. We all know that, but it's still out there, the possibility. So what do you think about that? Would that wreak havoc on our schools, on our systems, on our scheduling? Is it a bad idea? And why? And more generally speaking, if you have individual thoughts about credit recovery looking more like competency-based education, I think it would be great to hear them.
I guess I'll jump in. So I like to take up the latter because we at Ballou State this last year, and this will be our second year, we are 100% competency-based campus. And it has been a very significant lift and challenge. And of course, in that process, DCPS has at some point even proposed summer school being competency-based. And I sort of said, hey, I just did a whole year of that, and we barely survived because it's really hard to do. And DCPS sort of thought like, oh no, we'll figure it out, and really needed them to think through what that looks like and means, and what that shift in instructional planning and what that means for students and how they move throughout the educational experience. It's huge. I think it's a worthy task, and I do think, particularly for credit recovery, I think that that could be a component, but I'm not so sure, and this is just from my experience, that a student can easily move from 120 seat hours to competency-based overnight for a credit. It really is a mental mindset shift, and it requires a student and teacher, and it may take a while for us to get there. So I just want to, I'm not landing on a place. Yeah. I'm just using my experience to say it's a really hard thing to do.
Can I ask the indulgence of fellow board members? This is such a unique opportunity.
I'll cede my time.
Thanks. To ask them what that means. Why is it so hard? Use the time to educate yourselves about why competency-based is so hard. Like even an example of why that's so hard, Carrie, would be great.
So let's just couch this that my students are students who have significant learning gaps. And so that in itself, if you're trying to master on grade level, let's use the example of a Algebra 1 class. Mastery includes a set of cognitive development skills that a student has to achieve. If the student comes into the learning environment at a fourth grade reading level, which we know is so true, you're essentially saying for the student to master, they must be at a ninth grade level. The time that it takes to get a student to a ninth grade level probably exceeds 120 hours. So when we talk about what that would look like multiplied by multiple credits that a student is behind, and we talk about when that would happen in the day, because right now credit recovery will happen at the end of a student's day, you are talking about really difficult, hard work that needs to happen at the very end of a student's day with an educator who knows how to build a curriculum that can address those learning gaps. And then the student is not done and cannot move forward until they meet those competencies. And so that is the bar, and we want that bar. And we worked really hard this year to hold that bar. And there are students who, because the way the mastery works is several of my students didn't fail, they just continued their platform during the summer. And it took some students who started the class in September, they just finished the class today. Because that's how long it took for them to master ninth grade Algebra 1. And so when you hold that bar, that's how long it will take. And I just think people don't always understand that and understand what that looks like when you scale that up to a whole school.
Can I say something? I get the difficulty of that, but what I've been learning recently that there are half-year biology and chemistry classes. My daughter goes to Banneker, so they take biology and chemistry, and they're half-year algebra classes, and I'm like, how does that happen? So my point is sort of like the flip, like schools clearly are really restricted, and they're trying to make the C hours, and they're coming up with like some really what I consider wild and crazy solutions to sort of check off the boxes, and kids aren't, so our kids aren't ready for college, and we think it's in part because they're behind, but in part is because they're getting half-year courses and going to college thinking they passed biology when they haven't. So the idea of just moving along till you finish is good for me. And if you can take away the barriers, like the 4-year barrier, if we can like get rid of that stuff, so that, and then have ways to know that kids have mastered it, not that they have just gotten a grade in a class. And I wanted to say something to credit recovery. I tried to read through the document really quick. I couldn't do it very well, but I was just wondering something. I had a conversation with a parent whose student is taking a credit recovery class this summer. And I was like, well, how does that look on the transcript? It was like, does an A in credit recovery look like an A in the classroom? Because that doesn't seem fair to me. And then I did see in the document that you're going to have, that it said credit recovery on the transcript, which seemed horrifying to me. On the flip side, so I think it would be really great to have that conversation. Like, how do you give the kids credit, but I don't know, is it right to have it look like how does it go in the transcript? Like, if I've done a whole lot of credit recovery and gotten A's, should I, like, you know, how all that works is, I just wondered about it.
So Ms. Reid-Witt, you hit the nail on the head. That is a topic that has been discussed by this board with our colleagues at OSSE a couple of times. But I think one of the reasons that we rejected the proposal this evening was because it didn't get far enough into the questions that you're asking, and we haven't had enough conversation about that. There were witnesses at our meeting a month ago, public witnesses like you, who came and said that indicating on a transcript which grades were earned through credit recovery and which weren't would be harmful to students. And there was a lot of discussion about the rigor and the hours spent on credit recovery versus the hours spent for a regular Carnegie unit. Those are all conversations that this board wants to continue to have with the families of the children we serve and with with the schools that serve them. So we are committed to continuing this conversation. Did I hit that right, Ms. Wilson-Phelan?
Can I just say one more thing with respect to the language in math? I just think we need to turn some stuff upside down. So if we have a kid who's like, you know, a math genius or a language genius or something, we need to figure out what to do with that kid. And that means that we have to come up with creative solutions about how we teach that kid and what kind of opportunities. Maybe we have independent studies, but if we don't do it, then nobody's going to create it, and we're going to still squeeze the kids in boxes. I think what we have created is really, it's choking the life of our kids. They don't like school, and they don't like learning. And if we're going to create the workers, then this is cool. But if we're going to create the thinkers, we got to open it up.
You're again exactly right, and I think Principal Fuller, your team is working on this problem, and we need to make sure that we're helping as policymakers get that sentiment and that experience that you and your team are receiving to more schools so that more children can benefit, more students can benefit from that. And I'm also on your side on the flexibility piece. We have very, very restrictive graduation requirements, and it's going to be something I continue to work on. This task force was a terrific first start. You guys did so much excellent work and invested so much time. And the solutions package that you came up with is just brilliant. And it's not as far, I think, as we can go, but it is a really terrific step in the right direction, and we will continue to try to be bold and to move forward so that all of our children can learn where they are and so that they can be successful after they leave our public school systems.
One more thing, this
will be the last one more thing,
it's
unfortunately.
The last one, and it's the good last one. It really was heavily due to the leadership. It really was, because this could have gone nowhere. We were in
Absolutely.
a hole a few times, and they pulled us out and just organized us and screen materials. They did all kinds of stuff. So thank you.
Thank you all. We really appreciate your time this evening. Our second panel is a group of education experts, and we'll invite you to the witness table, starting with Sally Schwartz, a friend of mine and executive director of Globalize DC. So wonderful to see you here. Jennifer Zinth, principal of high school and STEM at the Education Commission of the States, and Dr. Linda Eno, Assistant Commissioner, Division of Teaching and Learning, New Jersey Department of Education. We are fortunate to have such a distinguished panel before us, and we really appreciate all of you lending us your voice and your expertise. We look forward to hearing from all of you. We'll start with Ms. Schwartz and then move to the right. You'll have 5 minutes, and we're being a little flexible on time this evening, and then we'll do a round of questions. Ms. Schwartz, if you'd start.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciated and enjoyed the last panel. So I like following them. My testimony is specifically on the issue of competency-based credit for world languages. Again, I'm Sally Schwartz, Director of Globalize DC. We're a local nonprofit that works to expand access for DC public school students to global education, language learning, and study abroad opportunities. And we believe strongly that this is the time to adopt a policy that will give DC students the option to earn credit through a competency-based method, assess what they know as opposed to how they got that knowledge. We envision that a well-crafted competency-based credit policy is a means of increasing, not diminishing, the quality of language instruction, expanding access and choice, helping address challenges created by the highly mobile student population here in DC, and better equipping and positioning DC students to compete for good jobs in our 21st century globalized economy. I'm not an expert in language, certainly not in languages. I went to DC public schools and did 5 years of French and 2 years of Spanish, and I really don't speak. So I'm not good at that. But I do work on the ground with students, and I see every day the inequalities, the barriers to access, and most of all, missed opportunities that we could really address with a more progressive policy that is grounded in the realities of what's going on with language learning. So I think first, having been around some of the discussion with the task force and reading things, I just want to say this, again, as a non-language person, that I think language is unique. The issue of competency-based credit for world languages is a little different. If you think about it, in what other subject area do some students come to school with a very high level of proficiency that they haven't learned at school, but have learned from outside? There's no other subject like that. And so we need to recognize that students are learning in this way. We have many cases where students, especially our heritage speakers, that their knowledge far surpasses level 2 high school language. So I think we as a city and you as education officials and OSSE especially need to decide if competency-based credit for world languages works best for our students. Is this something that is going to benefit our students? Are our language requirements for high school graduation about learning a language, or is it about sitting in a classroom for 2 years? I think that's a question that sits apart from all of the details in the policy that people have sometimes gotten caught up in. I just will say OSSE's current policy that offers waivers to award competency-based units doesn't apply in this case. You need to be a school, I think, to apply. We're looking for an opportunity for individual students to earn credit for knowledge of a language. The policy doesn't work. I have been working or struggling with DC Public Schools to get credit for a handful of students, and it's taken me over 2 years, and we still haven't resolved it. Individual students can't do that. Anyway, the question I'm here to address is what are the situations that students face? Who would benefit from this? And I'm going to just tick off some of the types of students. If you want to ask me more about it, I can. We offer an after-school Japanese language course. There are students who are studying languages in real programs outside of school here in the city. These are serious courses. There is no way for them to earn credit in DC Public Schools. These are languages that are not offered in the schools. DC students are studying abroad on federally funded programs because there is a need for speakers of critical languages. They're spending whole summers, school years studying a language at our government's expense. Doesn't appear on the transcript, totally outside our school system. Students have lived abroad. I mean, this is Washington, D.C. People come here having gone to school abroad. They come here, maybe they've lived in Russia. That's a particular case for 3 or 4 years. Gone to a Russian high school, the parent wants the student to continue Russian, and no, they have to be put in a Spanish 1 class, and there's no way for them to work outside to continue the Russian. That's irrational. We have heritage speakers who, if they had the opportunity to learn credit, they could continue with the study of their own home language and become proficient speakers that would give them an opportunity to get real jobs in this city especially. Totally missed opportunity that we don't offer them credit for their home language. We have students that switch schools, so you may have started in French and you go to a different school in DC and they don't offer French too. A competency-based approach would help solve that problem. And the last thing that I wanted to say here was it can also help in language immersion programs, sort of the articulation with the elementary programs and high school programs. So I'll end my testimony there.
Thank you, Ms.
Okay.
Schwartz.
Thank you.
I'll have some questions for you.
Okay, thanks.
Ms. Zinth, or I'm sorry, Dr. Eno? No,
Yes,
Ms.
ma'am.
Zinth. Sorry.
Yes. And so, will you bring up my slides? All right, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you tonight. I was asked to look both at high school graduation requirements and test out options in math and world languages. And so in the interest of time, I'll skip some of the slides that I presented in an earlier presentation, just speaking about ECS as an organization. This map
Could you hold your comments momentarily?
We lost the connector. Okay. Connector is out.
Sorry about that.
Just having a little technical difficulty here. We are.
Is it not on the screen? Or?
No. There it is.
All right,
Thank you.
thank you. So this map represents states that have state-level policies that explicitly mention exams and alternatives to seat time in math. And I would, one correction, as I started this map, I had New Jersey with a green. I was looking at foreign language and math at the same time, but New Jersey should not be green. They have just a policy on world language in this regard. But you can see here that there are a few different colors of states. Blue is where there's explicit mention in state policy of a state level or national exam the students pass in order to earn math credits. Yellow means it's entirely at the local discretion, but there is state policy mention of local alternative. And then green is a mixture of the two. So in Texas, for example, there is some local flexibility, but they say in state policy that students must be offered the opportunity to take X, Y, and Z in order to earn high school math credit. And so I'll spend the next couple of minutes unpacking this. I do want to point out, though, this map does not include other state policies that talk about proficiency, that talk about performance or portfolios or what have you, but make no specific mention of exams. That would be another presentation. And this table indicates what states, in those states that do have some sort of state-level exam or national exam mentioned in policy, which exams are being used. For the most part, states are using their existing end-of-course assessments, and I've listed here the subjects. New York should mention Algebra 1, Geometry, and Algebra 2. Just a couple of states specifically mention advanced placement. One state mentions CLEP, and then there are a few states that are outliers and mention some other alternatives. And so looking specifically at the details of these end-of-course assessments, there are a few states, specifically Georgia, New York, and Pennsylvania, that make clear that students have to hit a fairly high mark in order to earn credits as an alternative to seat time. And you can see what scores there are on those state assessments. In Florida, they have a 5-point grading system for the end of course, and a student who scores at the bottom of the 3 out of 5 will earn course credit. And then in Indiana and Louisiana, it's a little bit more flexible in the way that that language is worded in policy. You'll also note that these states do, in some cases, have some limitations in terms of either the number of courses or credits that students may earn, the previous academic performance that students must demonstrate in order to be eligible to take advantage of these opportunities, or the timing. So for example, in Louisiana, they say that once the school year has begun, a student cannot access this opportunity. And I think Louisiana may be the only state I'm aware of where they mentioned it has to be taking place before the beginning of the school year. And then looking at a few examples of these other states, these are all states where there is some local flexibility. South Dakota is interesting because they say that the Department of Education has the authority to establish assessments, but if a school district wants to offer an exam for which there is no state level exam, the district has the authority, if they've applied and been approved for a waiver, to develop their own exam that meets state approval. But you also notice in South Dakota, again, they have a pretty high benchmark for students to earn credit through this method. It has to be student passing with at least 85% proficiency. It has to be on the very first attempt. And so pivoting to other types of assessments other than end-of-course exams, Florida statute says that students may earn a quote-unquote passing score on AP or a KIPP exam. They don't specify that it's a 3 or higher or that it's 50% or 50 or higher on the KIPP. That's how I'm assuming that policy is interpreted in practice. Indiana says either a 3 or higher on AP or E or higher on Cambridge International, one other exams. And then quickly turning to alternative seat time and exams, a few states mentioned tutoring or various experiences out of the school day or school year. I can provide more examples afterwards. And then looking at world language, fewer states have policies on substitutes for seat time because frankly, fewer states have requirements that students pass or complete coursework in world languages for high school graduation. That said, there are a few states that do have test-out policies. We'll just look at Delaware and New York. In practice, districts are using ACTFL or STAMP, but the state doesn't necessarily collect data on how many students are taking advantage of these opportunities, and they also vary on who's actually paying for these exams. So it could be students are paying everything, or districts are making choices about which students they're covering these costs for. Alternatives, New York got rid of the regents in foreign language several years ago when they're having to address some budget cuts. The circled here is what the standard student experience would be where they take a year of a course. And then you can see a variety. I mentioned independent study. If you've studied at a school in another country, that could be another possibility, and so forth. So happy to answer any questions later on.
Thank you, Ms. Zinth. Dr. Eno.
Good evening, and thank you so much for having me. I'm Dr. Linda Eno. I am currently the Assistant Commissioner of Academics and Performance in the state of New Jersey and a former high school principal that took good advantage of New Jersey's what we affectionately call Option 2. Slide deck is up there. You have it in front of you, and I won't climb over my colleague to click through it. Oh, sure, that'd be great. Definition is called Individualized Student Learning Opportunities, affectionately known as Option 2, because it is located in Chapter 8, 6A, Chapter 8, 5.1, which is where our graduations, our requirements are located. And this is large number 2 below graduation requirements, where our 120 credit seat hours are spelled out. And this Option 2 requires a district to craft policy that allows students to demonstrate mastery of our New Jersey student learning standards through experiences other than seat time. There is no limit to the content of the standards that can be selected for alternate experiences, and a student may meet any or all of the high school standards prior to entering high school. So the requirement is only that these be the high school standards that are addressed. They don't. This does not cover addressing middle school standards, but can be met in part during middle school. The purpose behind this, and I'm on the second slide now where I'm looking at intent, is to afford students flexibility in how they demonstrate mastery of state's high school learning standards and to earn credits in ways that are more relevant, driven by interest, and reduce redundancy so that it becomes an individualized student path. district responsibilities include determining clearly what standards the student will be demonstrating mastery of, working with the student to determine what experiences that student will undergo to ensure that the student is engaging in a safe activity, and then that they have clearly articulated to the student and parents what assessment will be used at the end to demonstrate mastery of those standards. And the experiences can include a variety of things, including, we talked earlier about service learning experiences, internships, college courses, outside of a regular classroom, including online learning, and some other things that are listed in the PowerPoint. The initiation of option 2 can be done by the school. So a school, for instance, like the one that I ran, had to meet visual and performing arts standards for all students. We utilized an option 2 for all students. That was a group course that we ran that was a bit outside of seat time and outside of certificated instruction. A family or student can also initiate it. They can request to advance math and world language are areas that are common areas for students to request option 2 pathways to demonstrate their mastery. And I think my colleague did a very good job enumerating the kinds of situations that might inspire a student to seek those opportunities. World language is one of the few areas where we spell out what assessments a student might use and where the level of mastery needs to be set. So we require a student that is looking to opt out of a basic minimum world language to demonstrate novice high, and then we detail some of the assessments that can be used, but also indicate that a locally developed assessment can be used. I think it's really important to go back to just key components. Boards of education need to adopt policies. Those policies need to be clearly articulated to students and families. Courses need to meet or exceed high school standards. The instructional objectives need to be clear. There needs to be an assessment that demonstrates competency of those standards, and those courses need to be documented and recorded in the same way that other course success is, and credits need to be awarded. So I'll stop there and turn it back to the board for questions.
Thank you so much, and thank the three of you for investing your time in education and sharing your expertise with us. Do board members have questions? I have a bunch. Mr. Weedon.
So I'm going to begin with what's really a frustration. 2 years ago, I had a DCPS instructional superintendent say to a parent with me in the room that, well, first, let me preface this. The Spanish teacher for the school had been out on short-term leave for well over a calendar year. The instructional superintendent said to the parent, "It's okay. Your daughter can take Spanish next year. We don't have the resources to fill this slot. We can just give the other students who need it additional ELA instruction." When that's the attitude of our systems, we're not going to ensure our students are learning world languages. We're simply, and it came up in the last panel, checking the box. I agree with Ms. Schwartz that we really need to think about the goals of language programs. I'm sitting here doodling, trying to remember my daughter's path through elementary school, and I'm pretty sure it was Spanish immersion, Spanish, nothing, French, Spanish, nothing, Chinese. Then she went to a middle school that offers Spanish. We're not aligned, and it's often a search for a teacher, and quite frankly, she gets in elementary school, she gets 45 minutes a week, some years every other week, of language instruction. She can count to 10 in 3 languages. That's not what our goals of our program should be. So I want to give you time to complete your testimony. I've got about a minute left here. But how can we push our LEAs, and it's not just DCPS that does that. I use that as an example because it's a personal example. But how do we get them to raise the bar and have meaningful goals for our language programs here in the city, not just check the box?
Thank you. So I think I previously made this case. I used to work in DCPS in the central, I've taught, and I've worked in the central office as Director of International Programs, where for a time world languages were under me, but a brief time. But I've always worked in partnership with the resources that are in this town. This is a language-rich city. What strikes me about education in general, and the reason we have this panel, this discussion today, is that we talk about education reform, but we are doing things in old ways. In terms of language, we are still looking at language that can be offered within the 4 walls of a school. And that's a ridiculous approach to take, especially in a town that is filled with people who are teaching the language education resources in this town. Foreign Service Institute offered to teach our students. Defense Department Language Institute offered to teach our students for free. It's all over the place, but we have we don't connect with that. We just look at the traditional way, and as long as we have students, as long as we have inequity in our schools, we're going to have a Wilson High School that teaches maybe 6 languages going up to AP, and other schools that will be level 1 Spanish, level 1 and level 2 Spanish, period. So I think, to me, the answer is we need to open this up and look at how people really use languages and acknowledge that you need to have multiple years, and if you're not connected, you can't just look within the school. So we have to look across the 2 sectors, across the school system. I've long advocated language hubs within the system so that there's no reason why we can't offer French 2 to a student that has taken French 1, and then they're in a school that doesn't offer French 2 in this system. So I think we have to, it's not a question of hiring teachers. We have to just sort of break the system open.
Thank you. I take your comments about education reform to heart. We've done remarkable things in the city. Reform is not done. We need to continue to move forward to best serve our students.
Thank you, Mr. Weedon. Ms. Wilson-Phelan.
Great. I'm going to throw all my questions out there at once because our time's so limited. So I'm curious about, in New Jersey, how you fund that. So it sounded like students get a lot of individual counseling to ensure that an individualized pathway is truly monitored and supported, and not allowing students to slip through the cracks, which has been criticism of the few studies out there in competency-based education. So I'm curious about, is it a counselor to teacher ratio? Do you reorganize your workforce so that these teachers are actually trained? What did that actually look like? Do you have any results to share related to it being implemented in urban settings like Trenton? And then I'm curious about the assessments that exist for math and foreign language. This has been a question that's been put forward by OSSE and others. Could you just talk about the rigor of the assessments, how often they're used? Are they validated, tested? Are there questions about their rigor? And then are there any universal design for learning assessments that you would recommend? We've intentionally used the word assessment and not exam and throughout our set of recommendations so that it's accessible to all learners. I'll stop there.
So, should I start? So I would say that we are not as good at measuring the consistency with which districts are implementing this as we should be. So I would say that there is wide variation across the state in how diligent LEAs are being in monitoring the progress of students. And I would say that there are some districts both urban and suburban, that have very well-developed programs, and they typically staff them. If to do this well, you really need at least one person that is overseeing the programming, tracking, very knowledgeable about student learning standards and what is a meaningful assessment, and individualizing for students. When we were talking before about graduation requirements, it's not just the delivery of the content, it is what are the students' learning objectives. What should this student be aiming at with this world language? Is this a student that is already a heritage speaker, or is this a student that is aiming at a career in global politics and really needs some deep mastery? So I think that those two hand in hand go together. My own experience with using this was it was extremely beneficial to students. Being able to customize students' experiences and drive it with student interest and capacity is really critical for our millennial learners. I think that they are just a different breed of learners. They are not accustomed to needing to march in a linear way through content that doesn't inspire them, and certainly not interested in repeating for you if you didn't catch it the first time that they already knew it. I think you had a question.
Please, please.
Yeah. Okay. Did you want to speak to the foreign language on there? No. I'll focus my comments on the math requirements, or the math rigor. The end-of-course exams that I mentioned in Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Pennsylvania, I think also Indiana, have been used for their federal accountability, so they're college and career aligned to their college and career standards. Foreign language assessments, those ACTFL, I think, is internationally recognized. And then in some states, students can use an AP exam to demonstrate mastery. For the other exams, other than end of course or AP or KIPP, I can't necessarily speak to the rigor of those alternatives.
Yeah, all I know is what I need to know, and that is that the assessments for language STAMP, as well, all the ACTFL-aligned assessments are used by universities to place students, so it's widely recognized. I have to say our students took the STAMP test after 2 years, so this is a new after-school language program, and so going through that was really great. They did well on the test, which made me feel comfortable that just offering a test and having the credit depend totally on how they did it on a test at the end. It's a little scary, and they did well, but it was a very challenging exam for them and very interesting, but it's widely accepted. So some of the students are able to use the STAMP in their college. It's recognized, so they're able to move forward in Japanese, which they're going to be continuing. So.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson-Phelan. And I just have a couple of questions. If we're talking about assessments, I think Ms. Zinth and Dr., you both talked about sort of locally developed or locally driven assessments. And how do you ensure that a local entity how do you ensure the rigor if the local entity gets to create its own assessment?
So I would say that's always the challenge, right? For an SEA, what is the balance between overly prescriptive and so that you do not allow for the local context? And in New Jersey, we have 584 school districts of many varying configurations, and yet prescriptive enough to allow to ensure consistency and high expectations for every student. So that's the challenge. When we apply option 2, it does not eliminate the need for students to engage in statewide testing. So there's a sort of an accountability measure at the end, and our state report card is pretty robust, and will this year move to include pathways, meaning what was the student's pathway to graduation? Did they pass the state assessment? Did they use an alternative portfolio or one of the other menu of options? So I think looking for ways to ensure overall that LEAs are holding students to a high standard and being accountable to all subgroups is critically important. But what levers you pull to make sure that that's happening, I think, is exactly where the conversation needs to happen. So we've left flexibility there, believing that that's the right place to leave some breathing room.
Ms. Zinth?
The only thing I would add is looking back at the states where I mentioned the other exams in Alaska, they specify that the exam, once developed, needs to be approved by the State Department of Education. The same goes for South Dakota. South Dakota also specifies the exam must be standards-based. So I think just having, I know that with so many LEAs in DC, it may be a challenge to fulfill that. I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Well, I have another question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And I will wrap you in here, Ms. Schwartz. And as I close, is I am a native South Dakotan,
Oh, really?
so it was very
Graduated
exciting.
from the University of South Dakota.
It's very rare that I get to hear about my home state.
Yeah.
When I'm up here on the dais. So thank you. My high school experience was we had German. That was what we were offered, and I didn't want to take German. I wanted to take Spanish. And I was fortunate enough to have a mother on the school board. And eventually, my senior year, we got Spanish. And I tried to take German 2 and Spanish 1 the same year because I really wanted to learn Spanish. And my little high school brain could not figure those out because courses were back to back, and I ended up dropping Spanish and just staying with German because I'd already had a previous year. And in closing, Ms. Schwartz, how important is not only language but understanding a world culture as part of this, as part of the experience for a student?
Those are part of the standard. So the expectation, it's about communication and cultural understanding. So we talk about global competencies and cultural competencies. That's very connected to language. I will just say, I was a social studies teacher, not a language teacher. I've gotten into languages because it's a very, for students, particularly students in DC, being able to speak a less commonly taught language that is really cool and very difficult is a really great way to get at global competencies and exposure for our students. So the two are absolutely intertwined.
Thank you. And understanding that that needs to be part of the standard is
yeah.
really...
And it is part of the assessment, yes.
Wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Well, great. And the cultural part, totally get it. I know the difference between saying I'm a Berliner and I'm a jelly donut, which if anyone knows German, you know the difference. With that, I'm going to dismiss the panel with our... Do you want another round?
UDL question asked.
Go ahead.
Just, do you have any other suggestions or experience related to a non-exam based way to get credit? Like portfolio or something like that?
Sure. So we say that you have to have an assessment at the end, which we don't equate assessment and exam. So if you look on the last slide, there's a list of opportunities for experiences, and you can imagine those might be matched up to some different kinds of assessments. So if you are using an internship to demonstrate the standards around career readiness, you could imagine that might be a journal that's kept and a sharing out, and portfolio is certainly an increasingly popular way to show a linear set of experiences and growth over time. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and certainly with language, the speaking component critically important.
I just am not really firsthand experience with linguafolio. Are you familiar with linguafolio?
I've heard the term.
So in my conversations with the state of Washington, the state selects the assessments for testing, and they use STAMP and some of these other assessments, but they offer competency-based credit for a student with any language whatsoever. So there are no tests for many languages. And in that case, they go to linguafolio, which is a combination of, it's a portfolio kind of assessment.
Yeah,
So
and I
those-
think International Baccalaureate does a combination of an interview with the student, which is taped, and then there's a writing, but it happens over time, and there's some sort of formative assessments that get looked at, so that you're looking more at growth and depth, as opposed to a single snapshot where you're working off of a multiple choice exam.
And Ms. Zinth, do you know of any that are sort of standardized and held to the same level of rigor as an exam?
I think that's, yeah, so same level of rigor, I can't speak to because I haven't looked at them side by side, but I think the stamp test gets quite good feedback, has a speaking component.
It's a 4. It's speaking, listening, reading, writing.
Yep.
I don't know any specific alternatives to the exam models in terms specifically of world languages. No. The only other avenues that I'm aware of that states are addressing is looking at other types of courses. So, for example, in Texas, students can complete a world language credit either by taking a computer science course or by taking a CTE-specific course, for example, business Spanish or something along those lines. It's a little different.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks.
Any other questions from board members? Then I thank you very sincerely. You have our deepest appreciation for our witnesses for your testimony this evening. This discussion's been very helpful, and we will make sure that our friends at OSSE have all of the information that you've provided to us, and all of your testimony will be stored online so that folks can go back and capture it.
And I think we would each invite you to follow up with us if there's more we can do to support the work you're doing. Great, thoughtful work, and happy to be a part of it.
Thank you so very much.
And I would like to say, too, that we really want to see this get through the process, and please let us know how, there are many people interested in this, so please let us know how we can support this.
Ms. Schwartz, in particular, you are good at getting students to advocate for themselves. You've brought them to us multiple times in my 5.5 years here on the board. Continue to do that, probably most often at council meetings, because Mr. Grosso really cares when students show up. And we will find other ways for you to engage directly with OSSE to make sure that this remains a priority for them.
That would be great.
It will certainly remain a priority for us.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. And she's unfortunately not able to be here this evening, but as we close tonight, I'd like to offer some remarks about how wonderful it's been working with our Ward 4 colleague, Dr. Lannette Woodruff. Dr. Woodruff is under the weather at the moment and apologizes for not being here at what would have been her last meeting as a State Board of Education member. She unfortunately will be leaving the district. It was with a heavy heart that she informed us of that. But she's been just such a wonderful addition to the board. Her thoughtfulness, her knowledge, and the passion with which she approached issues was really inspiring. She's really going to be missed. There's a deficit on this board with her leaving. I didn't think many people could fill the shoes of Camille Anderson, her predecessor, and I won't say that she exactly filled Camille's shoes, but she developed her own style and her own advocacy, and carved out her own space on this board, which made her just as important and just as effective as Ms. Anderson was. So I'll offer colleagues, if in the event she's watching online, colleagues will have an opportunity to say a couple of words about Lannette if you'd like, or we can just wish her the best and give her our own personal goodbyes.
I'll say a quick word. I just wanted to commend how much I've enjoyed her collaborative spirit. I think that when I think about Lannette's contribution as someone who really always strove to keep the best interests of students in mind and had a peace and a calm about her that was really driven towards achieving results, I really, really value that about her, and that will be missed.
Thank you, Laura. With that, do any board members have news that they want to share before we close? And if not, then I'd entertain a motion to adjourn. With no objection?
Second.
Second by Ms. Carter. We are adjourned.